Hi, good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you, Dan, very much for that warm introduction, and it is nice to see you again. So, not only am I a Husky, I'm a former intern from the Seattle VA, and so it has been my extreme pleasure to be asked to give this keynote address today. I will start with kind of my There we go. Start with my brief introductions, which Dan has completely described my academic performance. I'm someone who lived in Seattle for almost 28 years. I'm a clinical psychologist. I work at the University of Washington. I also volunteer my time, and currently I'm serving as the president of the Evergreen Council on Problem Gambling, as well as a former member of the National Council on Problem Gambling, which is our national council that serves and works on the issue of problem gambling for the country. What I'm going to do today is kind of start with the caveat of I'm not someone who's going to tell you that gambling is wrong or gambling is bad or come from any moral position. Actually, I take a rather gambling neutral stance. Instead, as both a professional who works with patients who have different problems, I'm going to talk about people who have problems with their gambling, but I'm also going to talk about today the whole spectrum of the behavior and trying to take it back from as best I can the very beginning. So today is going to serve as an introduction to gambling 101, and then we're going to drill down over a little bit of time. So our presentation content is, again, I'm going to cover the spectrum of behavior and talk a little bit about where gambling came from, or at least where we think gambling has come from. Again, talk about gambling disorder, which is the thing I treat as a clinical psychologist. We're going to talk about the public health issues for gambling. We're going to talk a little bit about the effective treatments that are known for problem gambling. And then I'm going to end on an issue that I think should be relevant to this particular group, the idea that there's actually a therapeutic justice program here in Washington State that we've started as a pilot program, and talk a little bit about what therapeutic justice for problem gambling or gambling disorder looks like. As a point of question, there has been questions of where will people be able to ask questions. I work two ways. I'm used to actually having an audience live in front of me. I know you're all sitting at your computers, either at work or at home or wherever, maybe in a park enjoying a beautiful day. Regardless of where you are, if you have a question, we want you to go ahead and email it or put it in. I will, of course, try to answer it, especially if there's a clarifying question. So if I talk too fast or if I'm confusing about a topic, feel free. Moderators are going to stop me and make sure I clarify to make sure you understand what I'm saying clearly. We're also going to leave time at the very end to answer as many questions as people have about this topic, and I will do my best. I will also caveat that by saying, while I do consider myself a gambling expert, there are lots of things I don't know. So I will also maybe sometimes answer with, I don't know, that's a great question. We need more research, which is what you'll hear researchers say a lot about. That being said, let me just put us all on the same platform of what exactly do I mean by gambling behavior. Gambling behavior is defined as placing something of value on an event that has the possibility of resulting normally in a more beneficial outcome, or, in actuality, a loss of that outcome that you were looking at. Inherent to gambling is this idea that there is risk or chance. There's something influencing the outcome where you don't have control over and therefore doesn't actually know. Now, for most of us, and we think about it, this is going to be about money, right? This is about taking your cold, hard cash, putting it down for either a bet of some sort, and the outcome is that you're going to win more money. And that is true for the majority of people who actually gamble as adults. Where we see this is slightly differently is adolescent gambling. So we do actually know that gambling can also mean things like putting things like your best video game or your bike at risk with your friends, or playing for the next round of beer on a pool game. Now, again, these may not lead to problem gambling behaviors, but this too would qualify as gambling behavior. And all of the studies that I'm going to talk about today, we're going to focus predominantly on adults, and we're going to talk about this in normally the form of money or finances. Yes?
Got
a clarifying question already.
I've got a clarifying question for
Sure.
the audience. It's DSM disorder, question mark?
Sure. So we will be talking about the Diagnostic Statistic Manual, which is what clinical psychologists and psychiatrists use to diagnose somebody with what's known as, the new term is now gambling disorder. Previously, it was talked about as pathological gambling, and we're going to cover that. So gambling disorder is the new term in what's known as the DSM-5, which is what clinical psychologists and psychiatrists use to diagnose an actual disorder that would be a mental health disorder. But we're going to cover everything or talk a little bit about people who meet criteria for DSM disordered and those who do not. Great question. Hearing no more at this point, I'm going to keep forward, but keep them coming. So I wanted to start with just getting an understanding of who might be in the audience. And so we're going to do a polling question if you feel comfortable. So what we're asking for is simply, does someone in the audience or anyone in the audience know anybody themselves personally or themselves or family members or friends who've dealt with the issue of problem gambling? Because it's not one we talk about in our society very often. So if you have, there should be a button where you can say yes, a button you can say no. There is also, you could choose not to answer at all and just be quiet, or there is a way in which you can actually tell us if you'd rather not answer that question at all. They're going to give me a couple minutes where there are about 30 seconds where people are going to be able to vote. I'm supposed to do my best Vanna White impression to keep you all entertained. I am going to click the thing forward where we're going to get poll results. And I believe they will see them on their screen, or I'm going to at least be told what the outcome of this poll result. So just to keep you all, yes, no, rather not say, or you could just be quiet at this point. I think they're tabulating the score as we go.
We have 34.8% yes and 65.2% no.
Okay, so in this particular population of lawyers who are online getting CLE credits, what we are finding is about 35% of individuals are actually saying, yes, I know someone with a gambling disorder, which is, or at least a problem gambling, and about 60% who are not, which is, again, a high number if you actually think about it. Because, again, this is not a disorder that most people talk about. It's highly stigmatized, and most people don't talk about it. So I thank you all for at least having this some input of this is a problem that is affecting people. And that's normally what I hear, I will say, at cocktail parties or other places where I go. When they find out what I research, I will normally get people to tell me stories about how it's affected them personally or things they know. So I think it's an issue that we kind of talk about in society, but we don't normally put out in the open. So again, I want to really reiterate thank you for actually bringing this topic to light and having a discussion about it. I'm going to keep that in mind, and we're going to continue on. But I do, hopefully, as people have questions about this, if it affects their individuals that they love or themselves, we're going to have at the very end places you might go or ways that you might be able to offer them help. So I'm going to take one bigger step back and actually ask you to think about this, how I think about this, which is I come at understanding behavior, looking at it with a lens of what's known as the biopsychosocial model. The biopsychosocial model is this comprehensive model that tries to explain a way an individual affects behavior from both their biology of who they are, their cellular level, their drives that might be biological, their psychological, the ways in which maybe they think about issues about gambling or things that might make them gamble more or gamble less. Again, the thoughts they are having or the psychology of gambling behavior. And then also the societal, this bigger arc of what do we as society tell people whether it's okay or not okay to gamble. When's it okay? What's the legal age? All of these social issues. And so as a psychologist and a researcher, we try to look at this particular behavior thinking about how these things interact with each other. And we typically look at this from a biopsychosocial model. And we'll be talking about the biopsychosocial model as we go on today. So I love the fact that this topic is actually focused on the idea of ancient times. And actually, when I was looking through the research to prepare for today's talk, we did want to actually bring up that gambling has seemed to be with our society as far as we can tell from human society. So I picked these particular time points as examples, but there are also good examples all the way through prehistoric times. There are paintings where people are playing games. And this seems to be a part of, by playing games or putting some sort of game together as human beings, we also seem to have this element of risk that makes the game more interesting, where we think gambling came from. So what we can see historically, that gambling and gambling behavior has been with human beings regardless of kind of civilizations or different time periods. And so there are examples of dice being created in Egypt during the 600 and 1800 BC or 800 BC, in China, in another culture, a different type of game, but an 18-sided die that's used as well as a coin to help individuals decide that were found in tombs that were buried with individuals. Through the Roman times, we find, again, variations in dices and coins that were used for games and games of risk and skill. We also know that if you look at biblical times, if you look at the Bible, there is actually the casting of lots, which is, again, another example of where God's will will was being determined by the games and the outcome that would be placed on those particular looks. And that may parse up who actually got what parts of land they got, or what they actually did as moving forward as a culture. And so we know that gambling has been with us for a long period of time. And so it's come from ancient times all the way to what we have now. There seems to be a clarifying question. Great.
So the question is, what about addiction to online games? And you might be getting to this.
And we're going to cover that. So I'm going to hold that off for a little bit later. But the idea is that, yes, starting from ancient times, this idea that we have carried games from our past into actually games that we currently see today. And I'm going to, again, go quickly into the whole spectrum of where are we at modernly. So in modern times, to, again, move us past Egypt up until now, we know that these games have become big businesses. These big businesses drive huge economies in the sense that in 2016 alone, the land-based casinos alone from the U.S. and the world actually combined came to $450 billion that were spent in 2016. Another example or case point might actually be Macau, which is a island off of China, and a part of China, a special regulated government, that allows gambling in that particular location. They have moved themselves from actually being $10.5 billion that were spent back in 2007 to 2014, almost tripling that to $44 billion last year alone. And they have now overtaken a destination tour as the top place to go gamble in the world, now beating Las Vegas. So again, we've gone from really times just common games that were being played among individuals to how this has now become a very large corporated run business operation. Modern gambling also, drilling down to the U.S., in 2016, the annual report from the American Gaming Association has shown that corporate casino games alone took in $38.54 billion in 2015, and $8.5 billion were used for taxes or local state governments in that way. And so we know that tax revenues are a part of why we have corporated or incorporated gambling or use this as an industry. It's also affected Native populations. So a lot of people here in Washington State and across the country, Native American casino operators are operated within 28 states in the U.S., and there is $29.9 billion that was generated in revenue from those casinos alone. So again, a very big and robust way in which corporate America or sovereign nations from the Native American populations have used this revenue to generate and create benefits for their own communities. Oh, there's a question. Good.
So the question is, how is playing the stock market classified?
That's an interesting question, and that's actually debated upon by individuals, the stock market, whether who you were seeing. So some individuals have classified that people who are like day traders or people who are going under really heavy, quick turnarounds to take that to try to make a profit or a generation, the parallels are similar to problem gambling. And if it's consuming someone's life in that it would affect their business, work, or other relationships, some would argue that would classify as gambling. Others have said that's actually not gambling if you're using it as long-term investment. So it really depends on the type of definition and how it's impacting the individual about whether or not that would be seen as actually gambling on the market itself, or if you're using it for more future or long-term gains. And so there's actually debate in the field about who or where and how addicted this might be. And so there are some who have made an argument. I have several colleagues who have said that people who use day trading or are trying to game the market in a way that actually gets them a lot of money quickly, the parallels to problem gambling are actually there. And if it's affecting the individual in lots of different domains that it's actually becoming more problematic, they might want to seek treatment in order to help regulate this in a way that might help pull back the problems that might be related to this particular issue. We're getting to our next polling question, but these are great. Our next polling section is, I've now talked about the proliferation of gambling. At one time when I started thinking about gambling back when I was a lad, shall we say, there was only 2 places in the country to gamble. That was pretty much New Jersey or Las Vegas in Nevada. But now, over this now history, we are currently at where there are only 2 states that no longer have legalized gambling at any form. Legalized meaning the state does not sanction any kind of gambling. And I guess this is where I'm asking an educational question. Where do people think that is? And so my best guess is to give you some options so that you can do our poll at this point. So the question is, what 2 states have no legalized gambling? Is it Mississippi and South Dakota, Ohio and North Dakota, Oklahoma and Idaho, Utah and Hawaii? So I'm now pausing for a moment as they're getting ready to look through the results of that particular thing. But again, I think we've got answers. Here we go. What do people think?
Yes, it looks like people voted the most, 89% for Utah and Hawaii. Oklahoma and Idaho had 5.5%. Ohio and North Dakota had 2.8%, and Mississippi and South Dakota also had 2.8%.
Great. Thank you for those results. The majority of this group actually seem to know the right answer. It is actually Utah and Hawaii. These are the 2 states where there are not legalized forms of gambling, so no state lottery or no casinos that are actively involved in those state regulations. Now, I'm going to reiterate that while there is no legalized gambling, it doesn't mean that gambling itself as a behavior doesn't occur in those states. So I am originally from Idaho, have several friends who still live in Utah, so I know full well that there are people who play maybe games amongst themselves for like a poker night or things like that. I have colleagues and friends who work in Ohio or in Hawaii who tell me all the time that there's a large gambling that goes on with like mahjong within Asian populations. And so while there is no legalized gambling, there still is gambling behavior in all 50 states is what we would argue. So I'm going to drill down quickly and just kind of go over the history of gambling in our own state, in Washington State. And so what I'm going to be able to tell you is that originally, this is what I'm hoping to show you is how history over time has actually changed or actually gotten in a way where individuals how we've changed our mode. So again, back in the 1800s, when our Constitution was formed as a state, the results actually suggested that our own Constitution prohibited gambling of any kind. And so our Constitution was prohibiting gambling. I find this a little hard to read, so I am looking to see if I can, is it okay if I move over a little bit? I've now stressed out the, so I'm going to try to get a little closer, but basically, oh, go ahead. Okay. Stay where I am. Okay. So what I'm actually going to see is, are the moderators able to read a little bit? I might actually ask if you can give us the synopsis that people can actually see on the screen. Or maybe there's another screen that I can see. Sorry, I should have made these slides a little bigger for myself. But the idea basically is that historically, go ahead and, yep, thank you.
You want to start with 1898?
Sure. Yep.
1898, gambling prohibited by state constitution.
Right.
1950 to 60s, illegal gambling in Seattle and King County.
Yeah, so our very first was in 1933, I believe, where the legislature actually passed some form of gambling, which normally is bingo and raffle tickets, I'm assuming. Is that correct? The lower bottle? Yep, okay.
Yeah.
And then basically, yes, so, and then in the...
So 1933, I'm sorry, I missed that, betting on horses.
Betting on horses. There's our very first, that was our first legal games in Washington, is actually animal or horse races.
And 1971, 51 grand jury indictments for gambling payoffs.
Yeah, so this was, again, historically where in 1971 there was a lot of corrupted legal gambling or illegal gambling that was going on, and that this was particular individuals in our state who were normally government officials at this time who were indicted for actual payoffs regarding gambling and the legal and trying to have illegal gambling going on.
And then 1971, legislature legalizes bingo and raffles.
That is correct. And so
And in 1971, King County Superior Court rules 1971 Act unconstitutional.
So again, from a legal standpoint, we as a society were basically debating how much legalization were we going to allow. So we've moved from the 1800s having no legalized gambling and normally viewing this socially and culturally as a moral issue that we should not be doing at all. In the mid-70s, we were evaluating, and you could see where the law and the legislature is trying to reflect people's values. And still, the court systems were saying the things that were currently being passed were actually not fitting within the legal structure that we had. So in 1973...
the legislature authorizes pull tabs, bingo, raffles, and Vegas night fund.
And so, and then, yep, I'm going to keep having you go. 1974, nice job.
Card rooms approved. 1980, House Speaker, Senate Majority Leader, and lobbyists indicted on conspiring for payoff to promote gambling legislation.
Yeah. So again, from the 70s to the mid-70s, you will see an expansion of gambling going on where, again, the laws and regulations are changing the types of games that we start. So we start with horse racing, we moved then to bingos, and now we're into raffles and card rooms. In the mid-1980s, there was, again, a political scandal, as it were, that several government officials were again taking money from lobbyists in order to promote gambling in a very significant way. That being said, the mid-'80s, we continue to grow. So go ahead.
1982, legislature passes state lottery. 1988, Congress passes tribal casinos.
And so in these two particular instances, this is where the state itself historically is running out of money. There isn't a lot of money being generated. And so where we see is not just our state, but lots of states. This is where legalized state lotteries became the idea that we would be able to generate more revenue within our state. And that push for generating state revenue in this particular way both met the capacity or needs where people were asking for ways or games to play legally, as well as therefore answer some of these questions of how could we generate more money for the state? And so you see an expansion not just in our state, but across the country. And so most states, except for two now, have some form of recognized state lottery system that is currently going on. And the expansion in those areas that have Native American tribes are starting to ask or build these casinos and starting to get casinos up and going in their tribal lands. Yeah, there's a question already. Good.
The question is, what accounts for the sudden change?
The sudden change. We think it's hard to say because, again, there wasn't a lot of gambling research going on at this time. So I will say, and historically, gambling research, and this wasn't even classified as a disorder, a pathological gambling, which was the first diagnosable condition that showed up in the DSM, or again, that statistic manual, wasn't until the mid-'80s. So we see an expansion of gambling, and when we do, we also see individuals who are starting to have problems related to their gambling show up into clinics, and this is where we started to classify psychological problems related to the issues of things that we are currently experiencing as a culture. We think this expansion was actually being driven by people enjoying this or wanting this as part of a legislative move. So in some states, it was very much sponsored by the individuals suggesting or doing public initiatives to get legalized gambling in their state. And you actually also had a poll of people saying, we don't want this at all. Legislatures were feeling the pressure of trying to figure out ways to generate revenue, and by doing so, they expanded this initiative to have at least state lotteries. And then within certain states, building of casinos is what you see the proliferation of in the late 80s and early 90s. Do you read the last two? I think we're in the 1990s.
In the 1990s, tribal compacts introduced card rooms, slot machines. 2002, non-tribal gambling lobby for equal number of slot machines.
Right. So in the 1990s and early 2000s, this is again where the expansion of gambling occurs in our state. One is being created by the idea that there are already existing card rooms. The Native American casinos were also being developed and actually see an expansion of those. And there seems to be this tribal, non-tribal gaming that is going on, and which interact with each other so that both are growing. So we see an increase of tribal communities using this to enhance their culture and society as federally recognized tribes are able to do this as sovereign countries or sovereign nations within our country. And the independent or non-tribal games are actually trying to keep up as a corporation or competitive move, actually also want to see the same kind of games being legalized in theirs in a non-tribal setting as well, to giving people, again, providers options or consumers options of where to go or where to legalize gambling. These are the last two. This is the last slide on the history of our gambling in our state.
2005, Governor Gregoire signs a law that establishes a state-funded program to prevent and treat problem gambling using B&O tax at 0.13%. 2007, the Tribal Gaming Amendment for tribes and Washington governments provides ongoing funding to reduce problem gambling and support smoking cessation programs at the same rate of 0.13%. 2018, the legislature has directed the Gambling Commission to develop a study of the prevention and treatment services available in the area of problem gambling.
So to summarize this slide, where we're at historically is in the late or mid-2000s, organizations that I am a part of, so the Evergreen Council on Problem Gambling and other individuals and clinicians in this state are actually actively pursuing ways in which to help the public that are suffering from experiencing problems related to their gambling because of the issue of legalized gambling in our state. This proliferation of this large influx. And again, as I'll remind people, most people don't have a problem with gambling, but those who do have serious problems. And so what we were able to do was, with research, able to convince the legislature that there needs to be some sort of state money put forth to actually help individuals with treatment. So Governor Gregoire actually passed that in 2005, where appearing before the legislature, we were able to document the harms that are being caused by a particular type for individuals for gambling. And at this point, there is a B&O tax that is still in existence today at a rate of 0.13% of the funds or revenues that are generated from gambling are then put forth back to the state to help actually recognize or to treat this particular issue. And we'll talk a little bit about what treatment looks like and what services are available in our state. But that is the funds that generate for this particular issue. In 2008, voluntarily, the tribes themselves also started giving the same amount both to their tribes or to other organizations in order to fund gambling or the issue of problem gambling in our state. In 2007, the tribal compacts are negotiated at a federal level, and written into those tribal compacts specifically, we have individuals also giving in the tribes at the exact same rate the state is currently doing, and all of those funds, again, are from their revenues that are generated, then going to prevention and treatment services available for problem gamblers and their families. And then just this year, a few months ago, I and some other colleagues got together again to testify in front of the legislature, saying again that we were in need of more funding and more research for this particular problem. And so the Gambling Commission here in Washington State has taken the initiative and actually is putting forth a way in which to start providing studies that will actually identify the treatment and services that are currently being delivered in our state and where those gaps may lie, so that we can continue to provide good treatment and prevention messaging around this particular issue. Thank you very much, moderators, for reading the slides to me. And at this point, this is the history lesson. So I have not only played psychologist, I played historian for you of where we are currently in the area of history of where gambling has gone. And basically the take-home message is that we've moved into expansion. And it's not just our state. We've had expansion across this country and across other cultures and worldwide. Gambling has expanded. This next slide actually is just showing you the recreational gaming facilities or casinos that are currently available in Washington State. What I do not have here is every potential place where you could gamble. So if I were to do that, I think it actually might be covered the entire state. So, because if you think about that, you can buy a lottery ticket at almost every supermarket, any mini market, any driving place. The other thing where you can actually gamble, I left mine on the side, is your cell phone, right? Again, may not be legalized gambling, but we know that people can play games of chance on their cell phone, on their laptops, and so they can now move to gambling in the privacy of their own home. Not all of those games are considered legal in our state, and yet people still do those behaviors. And so gambling has now moved as close as you can just be a phone call away from actually gambling. So the expansion in our state is example. This example of casinos in our state suggests that almost everyone is about an hour to an hour and a half from driving to a place where they could legally gamble in a casino at this point. That's where our state has come from expansively. So that being said, what happens with the revenue, or where is the revenue coming from in our state alone? So lottery, in the last year alone, brought in $675 million. Horse racing, another way to gamble, has brought in $79 million. Other gambling venues actually are somewhere between $3 to $3.5 billion in our state as other gambling revenue. There are 21 tribes out of the 28 that operate casinos. So 28 tribes actually have casinos. Some of those tribes actually donate or give their money to other tribes to run casinos. So there are 21 tribes that actually operate casinos, and they brought in, is it 2.8 or 3? Actually, I can't see. Sorry. $2.8 billion? Yes. And we also know that there are non-tribal casinos or recreational, which are typically called card rooms, and there are more than 50 vendors there who are operating somewhere in last year about $263 million, and that there's over 1,700 plus pull tabs or kind of other businesses or nonprofit organizations or licensees that actually bring in 76 million. Around approximately. And this is, again, all of the legal revenue that is brought in, or the big money that is currently being generated for people playing games. This does not include all the illegal gambling that might have occurred during things like March Madness, or office pools, or friendly wagers, or either illegal gambling that might have occurred, or legal gambling when other people leave our state. So tourism that might have occurred for those who live close to the border in Portland and can go down to other areas or other states, or up to Vancouver, BC, and gamble in Canada, or those who take trips to Las Vegas or other places. And so gambling revenue has grown exponentially, and it is therefore a big business in our society. What I want to take home, or a piece that I want people to be aware of, is that in America, this is actually, again, a very common phenomenon. When we look at the actual lifetime rates of gambling, we know that about 80% of Americans have gambled at some point in their life. It doesn't mean they gamble regularly, but 80%. When we actually look at the same studies and look at individuals who gamble on a more regular basis, we find that 20 to 30% gamble more regularly. And when we mean more regularly, what we mean by that is they are gambling at least once or twice in the last 6 months. And that, again, I remind most people that people who do gamble, most individuals do not actually have a problem with this game. They gamble in a way that is non-recreational. So for most people, again, this is why I tend to be gambling neutral, most people don't have a problem with playing games or do this periodically and actually get some pleasure or enjoyment from it. However, most of the rest of my talk now is going to actually focus on the individuals who do actually have an addiction to gambling and what we can do or help to promote individuals who are having some problems. But again, I reiterate and remind people, most people don't have a problem with gambling. So, the gambling disorder, the DSM-5, which was brought up in the very beginning. Again, and these individuals, I'm going to pull up a couple of different things and give you a little history here. The DSM, again, as I said before, in 1980, diagnosed what was called pathological gambling. It was the first diagnostic criteria that was developed, and it was based solely on clinical expertise who saw these particular issues come to light. Over time, we have refined the DSM criteria. So originally, the DSM in the 1980s had 10 criteria. I have all 10 up here, but we have now in the DSM-5, which is the newest version that came out recently, they now only use 9 criteria, and of which you meet 4 of 9 in order to meet the diagnosis or the categorical variable called gambling disorder. I also want to say at this point, this term gambling disorder is also new, and there is a variety of terms that get used. I'm not partial to any of them other than these are the things that I have to talk about on my professional line, but you will also hear the term problem gambler, compulsive gambler, gambling addict. These are all terms that get used. In the medical field and in the type of diagnosis we are currently doing, we call this now a gambling disorder. We also talk about this in severity. So an individual who might just meet criteria at 4 is considered to have mild or moderate symptoms, and it continues to go up as more criteria are used to greater severity, or that idea of greater severity but with greater number of things. The other thing I want to point out is the parallels between these particular symptoms and other addictions. So one of the things that we know is that gambling behavior or gambling addiction actually was developed by the same individuals who are dealing with people who have addictions to substances, so alcohol, cocaine, or other chemical addictions. And so the criteria will be very similar in some ways of the individuals who actually experience this particular disorder. So I'm going to pull out kind of the parallels between substance use addiction as well as the parallels now that is gambling, and also identify the ones that are unique specifically to gambling. So the very first one is tolerance. Here, tolerance is defined as needing more, in this case, more money to be spent in order to get the same feeling back. So the idea of tolerance is if I started gambling and only started playing, let's use the example of I'm playing blackjack and I pay $5 per hand for blackjack. And then over time, the excitement wears off. I'm no longer excited for just betting $5 a hand. I need to move up to $25 a hand. This is the idea with gambling, that there would be some tolerance, that the feeling that you start with doesn't get you the same excitement or energy that you would normally do, and so you see an increase of money needing to be bet in order to meet this criteria. So for that, it's tolerance. The next example is, or the next criteria is, I think, withdrawal. This is also where I'm having difficulty reading the slides. Is it withdrawal? So withdrawal, again, is this idea or symptom in where we actually see individuals who, if they try to quit, cut down, or not return or abstain from gambling, they actually feel a greater amount of energy or irritability when they are trying to quit or cut back from their gambling. And so the withdrawal symptoms they are currently having are the things that might actually get them to go back to gambling, right? So this idea or feature of withdrawal. This is, again, very similar to substance use withdrawal, so that if you were to take away someone's substances, they also might have irritability or physical marks of how their substance being taken away from them makes them feel irritable or angry or agitated. And so typically this withdrawal symptom is a reason that people continue to come back to their gambling or come back to their substance use. The next one is normally loss of control. Loss of control is, again, a criteria that is defined as someone's impaired judgment around their gambling. It's the sense that I must gamble, and they continue to have this sense that if I don't gamble or if I don't keep going on, I really can't understand what's going on in my life. The gambling becomes such a priority that they lose this control, this inability or impulse to regulate or stop their gambling. The next symptom actually is called preoccupation. Preoccupation also is this idea that people spend a lot of time thinking about gambling. So they either reminisce about how good their last win was, or they reminisce about how to get money so they can go back to their next trip, or they're planning their next trip to the casino or to Las Vegas or wherever they particularly gamble. It's this preoccupation. It takes up a lot more time. And again, we see this as a parallel to substance use. Preoccupation with people who have substance use are constantly thinking about ways in which to get their drug, whether it be alcohol, like when they're going to get back to any of those places. And so preoccupation shares a cross spectrum of addiction. The next one is, can you guys read? What is the next one? Escape. Okay, escape actually is the criteria where the function, this is talking about the function of gambling, how gambling functions in this person's life. And we typically see escape is that they are trying to get away from something. So it's their coping mechanism, and that's what gambling is filling. So escape can be things like excitement. I'm looking forward to the excitement, and my life is really dull. It could also be that I'm dealing with trauma or depression, and this is my way of numbing out or getting excited. So some people gamble because they're looking to escape some sort of problems that they're having. So either they're leaving home because home is too stressful, they're leaving work because work is too stressful, and this form of gambling is in some ways helping them fulfill a reason why they're feeling like they need to keep gambling. It gives them some escape from their problems. Chasing losses. So chasing losses is a symptom that is unique to actually problem gambling. Chasing losses typically is the thought or the cognition that people have that I need to go back to win the money back that I just lost. It is unique to gambling in that it is about money, and it's about the thoughts you have about how you're going to win back the next time you go back. And so there's clearly this chasing losses that is a symptom that is clearly unique to problem gambling or gambling disorder. The next one is lying. Lying actually is exactly what it says. And this is also, this is unique in the criteria for gambling disorder. It is not unique among addictive behaviors in general. But in the symptomatology, you do not use lying about substance use as part of the criteria. But here we do. So lying, it can be lying to therapists, it can be lying to friends, it can be lying to family. Typically the lies are about how much you're spending or how much you've lost. And so the lying aspect can be one criteria that we use to identify someone who's had problem gambling. We know that people are lying or at least hiding their gambling. And so gambling by admission, like admitting that you've actually not been losing, is a typical example or sign that people are experiencing a gambling disorder. The next one is risking significant relationships. This too is not necessarily unique to addictive behaviors, but this is basically one that we see in almost all substance uses and all addictions. This is where gambling becomes the most important thing in someone's life. It becomes more important than their relationships at jobs. It becomes more important than their relationships with their spouses or loved ones or significant others. It becomes more important than their relationships with their children. In all of these cases, the idea that you are willing to risk your relationships, whether it be work, family, or friends, is more that gambling becomes more important. And this can, again, be an identifying criteria of why someone has a gambling disorder. The last criteria in this particular one is called bailout. And again, this is unique to problem gambling in general. Bailout is the idea or concept behind it is that you are constantly looking for other people when you are under financial stress to bail you out or give you some money. Now, it does a couple of things when we see that clinically. So either people will take that money and actually get themselves out of, like, let's say they're missing rent. They may take that money and actually use that money towards rent to bail them out this month to get them through. Sometimes, however, people get bailout money and then actually think they can go back and win their losses, so they'll go back to chasing with their bailout money. But bailout typically is a sign that you are looking for other people to fill in the financial gaps that mostly you should be able to cover with the income that you are generating. But that generation of income, they're either saving you from financial burden at this point to get you through to the next game or the next thing, or some people actually turn around and use their bailout money to try to win back the money and start their chasing of losses. The last criteria, so again, what you need is 4 out of 9 of this. This is the current symptoms. I'm going to just take one step back and talk about one that I think might affect this particular organization, which is illegal behaviors. So this used to be a symptom that we used in the DSM-4 or previous other criteria that we no longer use as a variable to define a gambling disorder. It doesn't mean that as a clinician I don't ask about this. So I still care about this issue and I think about this when I'm treating patients. And we're going to talk about this particular illegal behavior at the end of this conversation about therapeutic justice and why this might be an important thing, especially given everyone's professional role here as legal experts. But illegal behavior at one point, actually used to be part of the criteria. This is where individuals might be stealing money, embezzling money, creating sorts of fraud, floating checks, writing bad checks, stealing money or stealing personal properties, and then selling those properties to fund their gambling behavior. Any kind of illegal activity that individuals do. And it was used at one point as a symptom criteria to let us know that someone actually had crossed a line and actually had serious gambling disorder. The research, the epidemiological research that was done in the early 2000s really found that this criteria was not always endorsed by most people who actually met a criteria for a gambling problem or, a gambling disorder, that given that there was only about 2 to 3% of the population who endorsed this symptom, we decided as a criteria for diagnosable criteria, we didn't need it anymore. But as a clinician and someone who actually treats patients who have gambling disorder, I do ask about this clinically, and it's an important thing to know. And so while we don't use the criteria to diagnose, it's still an important feature of ones that we should be thinking about. And the reason I bring it up is because given your professional work, you might actually run into individuals who might be engaged in illegal activities that sponsor their gambling disorder. So I've given you a very extensive and hopefully understanding of what we as clinicians or clinical psychologists or psychiatrists use to define what is the gambling disorder. This spectrum of behavior. So I'm going to now talk about this as the broad spectrum and where we are from this behavior. So again, this triangle originally came from the ideas from the Institutes of Medicine. The idea basically is that the broad base, the green part of this triangle, is where most people are. Most people don't have a problem with their gambling, or even some individuals who don't gamble at all. There are people in the middle who, again, start to have this yellow zone where they might be starting to gamble and they might be having some problems related to their gambling. Some of those individuals might self-correct or correct themselves in a way. They've had one problem and they learn, I'm not going to do that again, and they learn from their own mistakes. Other people will continue in this spectrum and moving towards more the, as it gets red or dark red zone. And this is where we, again, the whole gambling, disordered gambling kind of broad umbrella. It might be individuals who are having some problems related to their gambling. They might be called problem gamblers, but they wouldn't meet criteria, full criteria for a gambling disorder. And the people, the smallest amount of this population really are, at this point, the apex of that triangle, or the reddest part of that triangle, where we would say meet a diagnosable disorder called gambling disorder. In the United States, this might be surprising to people, but in the United States, when we look at the epidemiological data, what we find is about 12% of adolescents meet this broad spectrum of having some problems related to their gambling to the apex of actually meeting a diagnosable disorder. The next part is around 16% of college students, again, are in this range of having some sort of problems related to their gambling, and around 6% of adults meet this full spectrum. People always ask me, so why is it higher in colleges? And my best thought about this is it's developmental, right? My best quote actually is probably coming from South Park, where the character Chef talks to the young kids, and he's telling you now, kids, don't do drugs, don't do anything risky, because you do that when you go to college. It's the best thing about college is you get to figure this out, right? And his advice is actually right. What we find is these problems start to emerge in adolescence. They get peak sometimes among individuals in college populations. This is a time and a place for everything, and it's called college. This is where people are developing their identities, and they will start experiencing greater problems related to this. And then for some individuals, they mature out of their problems. They figure out a way, or figure out, as they get more adult responsibilities, how to problem solve this issue. But about 6% of individuals and adults carry forward these individuals or develop them later in life. So we'll talk a little bit about this as we continue on in this discussion. Now, as I said before, I take a gambling neutral approach, and so we're going to move into the part of the topic where we're going to talk about the social cost of gambling. And as I've tried to reiterate, gambling has some positives to it. Like any behavior, it has some positive and some negatives. So if we're going to focus on some of the positives, I do want to acknowledge the things that gambling has done for our society. It has increased employment. So you actually see when people create recreational gaming centers, whether it be in Las Vegas or here in Washington State, we know that in actuality, people start having jobs, whether it be people who work in the casino or people who work around the casino. So it increases restaurants, it increases stores or economic viability of other places. And so we know economically employment starts happening when we actually build gambling casinos. So there are economic gains for our society. There are also increased revenues. I think I have shown you at the very beginning of this slide that there are large amounts of revenues that are being generated from gambling, and that some of those actually get funneled in back into forms of taxes that the state uses to fund things like schools and other issues. And there's even a small, less than 1% at this point, fraction of money that gets used for services for individuals who are having some problems related to their gambling. So there is tax revenues that are created from gambling. It increases tourism. So there has been some research studies recently that show that there's an influx of people who come to different states specifically around gambling venues, right? So the idea that we now have these recreational centers, that there are places where people can go gamble and go shop, those things actually bring in more tourism into our state. We also know it creates recreational opportunities. So one of the things that attracts people to these large gaming venues or casinos is that this typically is a place where they find recreational opportunities. So it brings in more bands, cultures, clubs, art galleries. The groups actually sponsor other things that actually don't deal directly with gambling, but actually do benefit the arts or other places. And so there are recreational opportunities that come about from these venues. They also increase property value. So there is really good evidence, again, from colleagues of mine at the University of Nevada that have shown multiple times that an increase of gambling or gambling venues tends to increase property taxes or property values. And so we know that a viable or healthy economy continues to attract people, and people's property values go up. I can also not state enough, I work closely with a lot of the Native American tribes in our community and across this country, and I cannot tell you how much gambling has in some ways transformed their communities. Again, Native American populations have typically had a historical place where they did not have a lot of money as governments or tribes, and the creation of gambling has allowed them to transform, where they're able to now offer schools, educations, all sorts of ways in which it has transformed their communities. That's not to say that there aren't people in those communities who are also negatively impacted by gambling, but there's also positive gains about what the tribes have earned by opening up recreational gambling amongst their people and amongst the tribes in general. So those are the economic gains that we talk about. There is, of course, also the other side of the coin, which is personal costs. This is what we actually see and what we look for in problem gambling in general, right? So there is definitely financial hardships. The latest paper I just published, or I'm currently trying to get published, is actually looking at the relationship between money attitudes and gambling. And what we find is that individuals who actually think money is a great way to power and prestige, it gives them lots of things, those people who hold those attitudes about money tend to actually predict that they might actually have more problems with gambling. And yet, what's interesting is that those individuals who engage in problematic gambling tend to actually talk about how much financial hardship they have. So we do know that given that gambling is normally centered around money and people's attitudes about money, we know that the loss of money tends to drive why people are actually experiencing problems. I work in college student settings, so I know that students who are having problems with their gambling spend less time studying and actually end up having less academic success or drop out, as well as individuals who are working and are, again, become preoccupied with gambling. They work less or they're not doing well at their job performance. Their work takes a back seat to their gambling behavior, and again, it causes personal problems at work. Problem gambling and gambling disorder is highly correlated with actually relationship problems. Everything from domestic violence rates seem to be correlated, child abuse, child neglect. There are definitely work relationships and family relationships that have been damaged by people's their relationship with problem gambling. And so then we know that there is actually a personal cost. There's actually legal involvement. This is, again, where a lot of you might run into your own clients who might have legal involvement because you're dealing with them, and what might be underlying their legal involvement might actually be a gambling disorder that has never been treated or even discussed. We know it's highly comorbid with substance abuse, depression, anxiety, suicide ideation, so the thoughts about suicide, and the personal gain or the personal problem of actually having suicide completion is high among pathological and disordered gamblers. There are, of course, also social costs. I was just telling someone earlier that I tried to find you the best studies that I could find. And again, gambling is a fairly new research project, and so there's not a lot of information about social costs, but what we could find is a 2003 study that basically said that problem gambling cost the society about $54 billion back in 2003. I would assume that this rate is actually higher now, given that we are almost 15 years later. We would expect that since the revenues have increased, the social costs have increased. But the idea basically is that it increased and rates of crime have gone up, the loss of work, bankruptcies, personal issues, healthcare issues. These all factor into trying to alight how much does this cost our society in general. And we're going to talk a little bit about public health. What we find generally is that the cost of society per additional problem gambler, so someone who doesn't meet diagnostic criteria, every year would cost about $3,222 in just cost alone to our society. Everything, again, ranging from their work to their personal life. And again, when the study was done, what was labeled then a pathological gambler, today we would call a gambling disordered individual. That individual cost society about $9,393. So again, the social costs are actually real. When I actually look at where we are as a state in Washington compared to our other states across the country, what we find is that Washington State currently spends around 10% or 10 cents to the dollar on average on treating this particular problem. And that we know that basically research suggests that if we were to spend for every dollar that we spend to address this as a social issue, we actually save $2 as a state. So the more we actually put toward services, we actually save ourselves money in the long run. So basically, societal costs can actually be delayed or reduced if we actually work towards treatment, prevention and treatment programs. And so again, the public health cost here is that a public health model suggests that we identify this problem and think about how it impacts all of our society, how it affects our public health, and that we have used this model in lots of different ways. We've looked at it for drug abuse, so we've talked about prevention models and how a healthcare program, if we look at it from a prevention model, how we might be able to spread messages about what are the problems or identifiable problems and services that are available. We've looked at it from, again, a public health model as how we immunize our children to protect them from diseases, again, as a public health model, and other ways in which we can actually address problem gambling as a public health issue. In doing so, looking at that same triangle again is thinking about where we would need to spend those dollars and how we might be able to do this. So I work in the area of prevention. In prevention, there are basically 3 stages of the types of prevention that we look at. There's a 4th that I am now talking about, which is actually called SBIRT, which is screening, brief intervention, and referral to treatment. That particular model of public health actually covers the entire gamut. We should be doing SBIRT almost at every level. But here, I'm going to talk about just the prevention side and then the treatment side. So universal prevention would actually mean everyone in that triangle. Everyone in that triangle should get some messages about how do we identify what is problem gambling or gambling disorder, and what are the services or places of where they could get this. We as a country do this for lots of other issues. We don't do it very well for problem gambling. And so I will just say last month was Problem Gambling Awareness Month. Some people might have seen some of our ads. We typically take the entire month to try to educate here in Washington State, and we send out public service announcements and try to put in commercials. You might have seen something either on the radio or advertisement that I might have played during the March Madness events. But we in our state actually put together a universal approach to try to get information. We currently show that in 1 month out of the year. What I would love to see in our state is if we could actually expand that service to be that we carry it every 12 months out of the year, that we get messages about the fact that there actually is services in Washington State and how to identify this problem. That would be a universal approach to problem gambling. The next one would actually be selected prevention. Selected prevention is identifying those individuals who might have some problem just because they already identify. So again, working with adolescents, building curriculum around adolescents who we know are at greater risk for developing problem gambling. Or in my own world, we work on selected prevention around college students. Or it could be working with criminal populations or selected individuals who come into chemical dependency or treatment centers because we know they're also at higher risk. So we can develop models of prevention specifically because an entire population or that group, that subgroup is at risk. And those, again, would be in that middle area. The smaller amounts of people would need to be selected prevention. Then there's finally, selected prevention. And then finally, the last model is called indicated prevention. This is, again, where we are screening individuals who are having some problems right now related to their gambling. And because they are, we immediately refer them into some sort of treatment, either a brief intervention or a much longer treatment where they might come in and actually talk to a therapist or or refer them to at least a GA meeting. So the idea basically here is that you are screening individuals specifically. So we might be able to screen in doctor's offices or dental offices or as individuals join the Washington Bar Association, and then be able to help funnel those individuals who might be meeting some problems directly getting them services they might need be available for. The next way we might use this public health model is also about treatment. Where do people go for treatment? Again, the idea here is that we have outpatient models where people could go and see somebody on an outpatient basis where they don't interfere mostly with their life. They may spend an hour a week talking to a therapist or going to a facility where they talk about their problems related to their gambling and work on trying to fix those problems. There is actually inpatient services. I will say currently in Washington State, there's not an organization that has a dedicated place for inpatient care, but that is not to be said that we in Washington State are not working on that. So the Evergreen Council is working on trying to identify an inpatient facility. At this point, for those who are seeking outpatient services, we send people people out. So at Evergreen Council, I can talk more about this, but basically we send people to Oregon, has an inpatient facility that's specifically targeted for problem gamblers. There's one in Minnesota that we send people to, and one in Louisiana. Those are the 3 best centers that we currently have, and we're looking to replicate that model here in Washington State. And then there's actually the recovery movement, which are the people who have done with formal treatment and are just living their lives, talking about their own recovery or how they've reformed themselves related to their gambling and are living their lives that way. Now I'm going to quickly go into a few slides that talk about the difference between comorbidity and co-occurrence. And so this is something that we in the clinical field actually deal with quite a lot. The comorbidity means that two things occurred in your life and that they typically have a positive correlation or a positive association with each other. So typically the way we see comorbidity is someone who might have had a problem with their alcohol in their life earlier or at times, and then later on they develop a gambling problem. And there are 2 separate incidents. So those would be independent co-occurrence in your lifetime, or comorbidity in your lifetime. The other way we look at this is co-occurrence, that some behaviors go clustered together and they occur at the same time. And our research has shown that when they are co-occurring, they typically cause more problems than if they occurred independently. So my colleague Jessica Krantz and myself have done 2 independent studies where we've looked at our particular data. We look at individuals who might have had the behavior in which they gamble only or they drink only separately, never on the same occasion, or individuals who actually drink and gamble at the same time. What we find is when things are co-occurring, they typically have higher severities for both their problem gambling and their drinking. Both of those problems get worse. It's almost like 1 + 1 = 4. Instead of 1 + 1 = 2, versus if people had those 2 behaviors occur separately at different times. And so that's the difference between comorbidity and co-occurrence. One of the things I'm going to point through, there are going to be a lot of slides that are graph-driven, and primarily what they're going to try to show you is that there is a lot of this comorbidity. Problem gambling is pervasive in that it shows up on lots of different people's lives. And so what we're showing here is the different rates in which individuals, different types of disorders people have. And so the rates across the way are the different types of disorders that people might have, whether it be substance use, alcohol use, and at the very end of those spectrums are normally mental health disorders. There's been a translation problem when we were moving from computer to computer, but the idea basically, Hopi, is you'll be able to pull them apart, is that basically the rates of these particular things are at national levels, and that the rates of problem gambling are showing, again, on the x-axis, or going across is the levels in which we see people in epidemiological studies who report this problem along with problem gambling at some point. And then basically the lifetime prevalence of problem gambling in this particular study was found to be a little less than 1%. This was a national study done by Nancy Petrie and colleagues that basically showed about 1% of adults meet full criteria. And that may not sound like a lot, like 1% of people are experiencing this problem, but that actually, if you multiply that by the amount of people in the U.S., it's actually quite a number of people. It's something like 21 million people might actually be experiencing these problems related to their gambling. So it's still a significant population. We also found, when we're drilling down and looking at the epidemiological data, that people who have a problem gambling or a pathological gambler were 10 times more likely to have another substance use history in their life. So people who are coming in now because of their problem gamblings, when we look at their past, we know that they've actually had another substance use disorder. Normally it's alcohol or other drugs that they are related to. We also know that the rates of other mental health disorders are also highly comorbid, so that individuals who might have had either a substance use problem in their lifetime or any other substance use, again, are much higher among those who have a gambling disorder. And again, trying to pull this apart a little bit, the idea that problem gambling and other psychiatric symptoms, so everything ranging from depression, anxiety, and other psychiatric disorders, bipolar disorder, tend to again be seen with people who might also have problem gambling. And
Just a clarifying question, 1% of the population is 20 million?
I may have done my math wrong, but yes, it's a pretty, so the 1% is about the same amount of people who also experience schizophrenia, which is again a very serious mental health disorder. The reason I point that out is because basically when people hear 1%, they think, oh, that's not very big and we don't need to worry about this particular problem. But 1% actually does, when you multiply it across the number of millions of Americans who are here, it's actually quite a significant number. And I actually have, going further down, the exact numbers that we have in Washington State. I think that's right, but you could actually be catching me on, I've misconstrued numbers in front of me. But yes, we are looking at a high, even though it's 1%, it's still a significant number of Americans who are affected by this problem. We also know that the rates of problem gambling and the substance use disorders are about 4 times harder, again, in this particular study, as we look at the epidemiological data. And about 10% of those who actually seek treatment actually have an active or current substance use disorder are also ongoing. So someone who might come in for their problem gambling, when we actually ask them what other things might be going on, about 10% of those still have an active substance use. That active substance use typically is alcohol, then followed by other drugs. Even those with a past substance use tend to have more problems. So if you have had a substance use problem and now you have a gambling problem, it actually, typically the epidemiological or the research data have suggested that the people who are experiencing their gambling problems actually have a greater severity of problems when we look at their gambling now. Those people who have actually had a past substance use, still not active at this point, but a past substance use, actually had more years gambling with problems. They had greater frequency of gambling, so they gambled more often. They also had greater psychiatric distress, meaning they had higher symptoms of anxiety or depression with them. And then we actually, if we continue to drill down, those who actually had an active substance use problem also had things that were completely identified with cigarette smoke. So again, a very important issue is nicotine dependence or nicotine use, which again is normally allowed in the casino environments for some individuals. And those who smoke and gamble, this seems to again be a highly comorbid substance. And what we find is that the people who actually had active substance use in the form of nicotine or smoking, as well as gambling, also had other problems related to spent more money and more often, and actually had more problems related to their gambling or spending. They actually got to gambling more, again, greater severity, and again also had this idea of experiencing more problems or psychiatric disorders. So normally they had higher rates of anxiety and depression. And if you think about ways in which people smoke, right? So smoking tends to be, the reason I use is because it's helping me reduce my stress, and gambling is also something that reduces my stress. You can see why these two particular things, people are trying lots of things to control their stress or their anxiety or depression. And so this might be a reason of why they might be having higher rates when we look at these two disorders together. We also know that people who actually have who are actually seeking treatment, which again is not rare, or is rare that people actually seek treatment for substance use disorders, but those who do also have higher rates of problem gambling. And when they do have higher rates, they typically are people who have a greater unemployment, they have more legal problems, again, things where you might run into them, have greater social impairment with their family or friends. They're having greater prevalences of nicotine dependence. They're actually having more alcohol use, more substance abuse. And so again, these are individuals who are already who've come into treatment for substance use disorders. And again, it is not always common that people in substance use disorders who are seeking treatment are actually being screened for problem gambling. So we are highly encouraging those who work with substance users or deal with cases with substance use, you be thinking that they may also have a gambling problem or a gambling disorder. I'm going to skip these last two slides because they're ones that we've seen before, and I think I've now at this point drilled down that problem gambling and gambling disorder is very common, and it's common that they don't just have gambling disorder, they have lots of other problems. They may have other mental health issues such as depression, anxiety, or things like that. So the other serious problem, or the thing that we see, is this high rate of suicidality among individuals. And we typically see somewhere in the population depending on the study that is done, so again, there are not a lot of studies on this particular issue, but when studies are done, ranging between 12% of people who've said they've had suicide ideation to 92%. Again, when we're looking at people who have had problem gambling, 92% of individuals said, yeah, I've thought about gambling, or I thought about suicide as a way out of solving my problems. Again, when we look at attempt rates, those go a little bit lower because that's actually where the behavior changes as a spectrum. But the idea here is that suicide attempts go from about 4% to up to 40% in some studies. That's, again, where someone has made an actual attempt on their life. And then gambling-related completed suicides range somewhere between 7 and 26% looking at the studies. Among those of completed suicide, the rates of gambling-related suicides are somewhere around 6 to 17% who have completed or successfully completed suicide. And this is, again, a hard thing to get to from a research point of view, because normally, whereas an autopsy might tell you if there's any substances in their thing, we don't actually have really good indicators that someone had a gambling problem or that is their motive of why they committed suicide. And so there are these now things that they are starting to talk about, which is financial autopsies, where individuals start looking through to see if perhaps their gambling could have been a reason or a rationale of why they committed suicide. But we don't always have really good, clear understanding until family members or other people discover maybe their attempt was about their actual gambling. So how do we describe the discrepancies here? Basically, the discrepancies are the different populations that have been done with research. Research is not perfect. It's better than not doing research, but again, it's not perfect. And so the rates of the discrepancies are again, I agree, wide-ranging, and we should do better as researchers trying to figure out ways to get at better rates. But we do know that this is a very serious behavior and that it is not uncommon, and that we typically see suicide attempts or at least completed suicides around the idea of huge financial losses or breakups or being discovered. And the idea, again, of gambling-related suicides varies by individuals when we look at the studies. So does disordered gambling cause suicide? Again, I cannot tell you with any complete certainty as a scientist that is true, that this is what caused the suicide, but we do know that it is highly comorbid or highly correlated with individuals who are having a gambling disorder actually do have at least an increase of suicide ideation that you'd want to talk about or try to get people help about. You'd want to be able to know if they've actually started to make some sort of attempt, and then actually trying to get them treatment or seeking help for those individuals who are. So the answer, in my opinion, is you should, at least when people are having this discussion, be asking gently about this question and trying to get them resources about why we think this is important to be identifying individuals who have problem gambling with suicidality. Why do people have suicide ideation with gamblers? There's, again, not a clear indicator of why, but we think these are all the reasons that lead to it, right? So it's financial problems. If they have all of a sudden been discovered that they have really bad credit or debt or things have gotten out of hand, if they've had legal issues, we see people who are facing criminal prosecution as, again, another reason why people are worried about this. And so you really want to be aware of what these things that might be driving someone to have higher risks related to problem gambling. And again, this is, again, another co-occurring behavior. When people are actually drinking, they make impulsive decisions, and so it is more likely, again, that this is a co-occurring behavior with other behaviors. And we see this also in the gambling environment. So we know that in actuality, when we talk about this behavior, one thing isn't just happening alone, right? You can do, in some ways, lots of different vices in casino gambling. You will get served alcohol, you can smoke cigarettes. There are lots of ways in which these behaviors co-occur. And substance use seems to exacerbate gambling, right? So there have been several studies that have looked at the reason that you get alcohol either free or cheaply in environments is because when you are drinking and gambling, you actually spend more time gambling, you spend more money gambling, and your consequences go up. There is actually, given that we have legalized marijuana, there is now just new research looking at how marijuana affects decision-making, and when it affects decision-making, we also see that gambling losses also get bigger. And again, thinking about this from the biopsychosocial model, the idea here is that there is your biology or your genetic makeup of who you are and the sensations you are feeling that actually kind of bring up this idea of why we'd want to look at this particular behavior of gambling. We talk about the psychological. These are the thoughts you are having or the way in which you're thinking about your gambling or even personality variables that make you more prone to gamble. And then there's the sociological. These are, again, the legals, the laws, the culture that tells you is permissible or things that we should do about gambling. And so we're going to look at these just real briefly. Is that why do people gamble? Well, we know that they do it because there's a biological reason. What we know about gambling and the way this all works is that there's primarily these fancy neurotransmitters that get excited about gambling. So the biggest system at this point is considered dopamine. We know that when people win or when they get close to winning, they get a little release of dopamine in their brain. That dopamine actually feels good, and that is called the reward pleasure center that actually continues. This same thing fires when the same dopamine response system happens when people have sex, or when people eat really good food, or when people actually take substances. These neurotransmitters start going. People like the feeling or sensation, and that's what seems to drive this behavior from a biological point of view. We also know that gambling occurs because people actually have learning histories. People might learn, and most of the research suggests that people learn to start to gamble with their families, right? They play card games, and everyone puts in penny annies. And so we know that people learn gambling games and gambling history from seeing others do it, having family members do it, or all things like that. And so there really is also this idea that there are different types of reward systems that are built into games. So the way in which we looked at this is kind of, which way do you think, if we're going to, again, this is a polling question that's coming up, is what way do you actually think is the most reinforcing way to get people to gamble? This is what slot machines are built on. The idea is if there's a reinforcing pattern. So there are 4 different patterns that are on here that you can look at. There is basically the, can you guys read that? Sorry. Can you read me the first word? I can't always see my slides. Sorry, everyone. Fixed interval. So fixed interval is, again, that your interval ratio is that you get paid out every, so it could be every 3 turns, or a fixed ratio. The next one is variable ratio, where that ratio is actually variable, and we actually don't have a specific way of knowing when that variable is going to be. The following one is a fixed ratio. So again, a fixed amount of time of varying, and then there's the actual variable ratio, which actually, again, is a variable that is unknown to the person, but is on a variable ratio where the individual continues to go through and get reinforced at different times for pulling a lever on a slot machine. So if you were going to build a slot machine and wanted your players to play the most, what variable ratio do you think is the most reinforcing?
So the results came in.
Great.
And we have 5.9% for fixed interval, 20.3% for variable interval, 11.1% for fixed ratio, and 62.7% for variable ratio.
Very good, everyone. So the 62% is actually right. It is the variable ratio that is the most reinforcing in the slot machine. It is the one that makes people gamble longer, right? And so having that knowledge or knowing what that is actually feeds into the game and how it's built, and is the reinforcing principle behind why people continue to play at slot machines. It's that fixed ratio. So the next question is, this is again, how do you make these decisions? So if you saw this block of, if you were playing the roulette wheel, and we were just playing red or black as our game of choice, and you saw a series of things that came out as black, red, black, black, red, red, black, red, do you know which way you'd place your bet? If you were going to bet on this, would it be red or black? And again, this is not a polling question, but I'm going to give you the answer. Let's say you actually saw it this way. You saw black, 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 black all the way through. What would you put down as your next one? Now, when people go back and do this, some people say, the next one's going to either black or red. They don't know. It's more of a 50-50 chance. Whereas when they see this pattern, they all black. Some people actually say, the next one's going to be black because it's always landed on black. And other people in the room will typically argue, no, it's red because red is due, right? This is basically, regardless of this is what we call the gambler's fallacy. It's the idea that what you forget is that little ball doesn't know it's fallen on black all of those times, or black or red. It doesn't care. It's independent every time they spin the wheel. And so there is this thing that we, human beings, try to understand and interpret our society. This is learning history, and we use whatever we can to figure out what ways in which this works. And that's how we make our decision making. We forget, and part of the reason we forget is because we like the game, it's fun to play, is that we forget the gambling fallacy is that we think that we forget that there's independence in each time that little ball is thrown. And so that's what kind of makes gun games fun and the outcome an unknown. And so there actually is this last piece of this is why people gamble as cultural norms, right? So what we see in the culture is that people gamble for fun, people gamble because it's pleasurable, people gamble because they see it in movies. Who hasn't seen James Bond and want to be like James Bond, knowing that he's going to gamble on Baccarat? We see advertisements. We talk about it in the media when there's a big Powerball. We as a culture have set the norms that gambling is okay, gambling is socially acceptable, and gambling is what you're supposed to do. So sociologically, we know that gambling norms also cause people to gamble. So I'm going to turn the last parts of this conversation into the treatments for problem gambling and then end on therapeutic justice. So on the treatments, I'm going to just briefly say that there are really good treatments and that there are things that we're going to talk about. I will first start that there is no medication currently by the FDA approved for problem gambling at all or for gambling disorder. There is, however, some evidence of a drug known as Naltrexone. Naltrexone is normally used as an opioid reductionist or antagonist, and it's been shown to help reduce craving. And so it's been used primarily in alcohol. Naltrexone reduces alcohol craving, and the theory is, since it works on the same receptor system, that we might be able to give it to problem gamblers. And so there are some suggestions, again, not large trials yet, so again, I caveat this being said, but primarily there may be some drugs that may eventually come to market that might actually reduce the craving related to gambling. But again, the jury's still out and more research needs to be done. The other piece that we'll talk about is what I've also talked about is this idea of natural recovery. About 20 to 30% of individuals, when we actually query them, who said they've had problems with their gambling, but figured out without ever seeing someone like me or any kind of formal treatment, have come into recovery themselves. They figured out how to fix their own problems. And so we know in the treatment literature, about 20 to 30% of individuals return to non-problematic or abstain from gambling at all, and they have what we would call natural recovery. The other thing I would target is that there is a really robust self-help group modeled, again, which is known as Gamblers Anonymous. It is very much like Alcoholics Anonymous, and that is what it was modeled after. In doing so, what we see is, again, these are free meetings where people can actually meet. And when we actually look at the research, there's very little research done on Gamblers Anonymous, partly because it's an anonymous program, so it's not like we can do a lot of research. But when we do, we find that people who are in treatment with going to GA actually have good success. And they even have more success or better success when they combine that GA treatment for some individuals who are also going to a therapist. And so we know that combining these two seem to give people the most success, but GA alone works for a lot of individuals. And so there actually are GA meetings, and we typically acknowledge that the self-help program and the self-help movement has been really, really successful for those individuals. Where I have been trained and what I have been trained to do is what's known as cognitive behavioral therapy. This is, again, where we look at this model, this triangle between your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. We help individuals identify what is their goals or treatment goals. We work with them. It's typically time sensitive, or we try to, again, the research evidence that we have is that normally it's between 12 and 20 sessions that an individual be working specifically on problem gambling, and we help them first identify what are the reasons or functions that their gambling occurs problematically, and what can we do to help those individuals return to either no gambling at all or some sort of moderate gambling if that works for them. So again, we try to meet people wherever they're at and try to, again, tailor our treatments to help them identify what are the issues or triggers that relate to their gambling and how their thoughts might be generating problems or what behaviors they're doing as a way to return their gambling to either normal or an actually move them towards an abstinence-based approach for themselves. And then the last movement, I would say, in treatments have really been this idea of mindfulness-based relapse prevention. Mindfulness, and I was looking at the website at the Washington Bar Association and know that they offer mindfulness groups. Mindfulness is this way of actually understanding or thinking about your behavior. This is where you place your attention where you want it to be in a non-judgmental way. So it comes from this idea of Buddhist meditation practices that have been moved into psychotherapy world, in which where we help individuals by focusing on the present, they pay less attention to, again, their thoughts and their feelings, and by being non-judgmental to them, they actually have a way of returning their gambling to a less problematic way or to an abstinence approach, whichever, again, their goals might be. But this idea of teaching mindfulness and mindfulness meditation has been starting to be shown to be effective in helping individuals who are looking for problem or treatments for their own problem gambling. Finally, I'm going to move to the last part of this, which is therapeutic justice. The therapeutic justice system in our state was, again, sponsored by the Evergreen Council on Problem Gambling. The idea is that it's very much like drug courts that currently already exist. And so these are programs you already might have heard of or at least thought about. And we have had a pilot study that was done in Pierce County looking at the use of identifying individuals who are in the criminal justice system who are having some problems related to their gambling, who are ordered by a judge to undergo treatment for over a year and then actually be involved in treatment for their problem gambling and other substance use related issues. And then if they have completed that program successfully, were actually adjudicated from having their problems continue to show on their court records. We are currently still trying to keep this program going, and our pilot funding has fallen out, but we do actually have some fairly good results to show this is effective. What I'm going to play for you now is Judge Farrell. Mark Farrell is actually the senior justice from the Amherst court and is the individual who actually was the person who started gambling court, the first one in our country. I'll have him talk about what the program is and what it's not.
First of all, I'd like to thank Lieutenant Governor Brad Owen for convening this discussion on therapeutic justice for problem gamblers in Washington State. And thanks to all of you who are attending today for engaging in this proactive discussion on this hidden addiction termed by the American Medical Association as having a devastating burden on human health and development, and also as seen by the American Psychiatric Association as a disorder of impulse control, as of yet really not dealt with proactively in the criminal justice system. If I weren't here in Amherst today conducting gambling court, I would certainly be there with you in person to share with you how I feel that the health and welfare of Washington State's residents, as well as of your budget, would be far better served by gambling court. I'm hoping that you'll all become champions and advocates of this important issue. In the traditional criminal justice system, we like to pigeonhole people as being criminals. They're bad people, so therefore we punish them, put them in correctional facilities, or we put them on endless periods of probation. At no time do we really focus on the disease process that brought about the criminal behavior to begin with. If you have a disease, you treat the disease. You don't punish the disease. We interdict and cut through it. We focus on the aspect of dealing with this addiction, dealing with the disease that they have, allow them to gain back their self-dignity and their personal responsibility, and then return to the society with the idea that they're not going to commit a crime again because of the addiction. This is what the traditional criminal justice system doesn't get. Moreover, the more important part is you can do it in a much more cost-effective way. Probably 1/6 or 1/7 of the cost, because there's so much expenditure involved in putting people in jail, in keeping them in jail, because what you're doing is you're focusing on the person. And through a managed, contractually based program, bring them back to society as a productive member. Gambling court or drug court, no matter which one it is no day at the beach. It's far tougher for that defendant to comply with a program that could extend beyond a year in duration than it ever would be for the typical quick plea and out type of endeavor. And in a diversionary court based on progress, we may reward them with certain different types of accolades or particular tokens, or we may sanction them. And if the behavior is intentional, they may serve time in jail for a day or two. When the program is completed, we graduate them from the program and then deal with their criminal charge by virtue of either a reduction to a lesser charge or what we call in New York an adjournment and contemplation of dismissal. And I'm not suggesting for a moment that we coddle individuals who commit serious crimes, who reap havoc and damage and loss upon other people, innocent people. But it's also important that we're sensitive enough to realize those individuals who we can return to society as productive members and how we can deal with their addiction, just like with drugs and alcohol, and that we can deal effectively with it and that we can deal appropriately with it in the criminal justice system.
So I'm going to basically move forward at this very last and talk about, in the last couple minutes that I have, to talk a little bit about how things you might think about kind of as not only that therapeutic justice works, but how this might affect lawyers in your problem gambling. So one of the last things I was asked to talk about is that you, as lawyers, have high-stress jobs. You are dealing with a lot of trauma. You are dealing with a lot of individuals who've had a really hard time. And in doing so, people might tend to use alcohol, drugs, or even gambling in this case as a way to escape. And so we know that given that people have high-risk situations or high-risk stressing jobs, it is likely that those individuals might be seeking gambling, and it might start in a harmless way of just looking for some fun. But if it turns into a problem, that's what we're hoping to address. And so we know that in actuality, lawyers in and of themselves, because of their high-risk, stressful jobs, as well as their active engagement sometimes of risk takers themselves because of high-risk situations or court situations, they might actually be prone to have problems related to their gambling. Things that we want to know is lawyers might actually have a problem gambling because they also might come in contact with their clients around this. So they're handling bankruptcy filings or embezzlement issues. Those individuals or your clients might have gambling problems. They might actually be people who are dealing divorce cases around gambling. There might be elderly care patients who have become guardians and have access to funds or controls that we want to be people aware of, or people with other addictions. And so there are warning signs. It's whether or not people are spending more money or more time on gambling, hiding or lying about their gambling, having financial problems, chasing their losses, or if gambling is no longer fun. What you should know is that there's actually treatments or available for this particular issue, and there are really good treatments that actually have good outcomes, that actually people get better over time. And so what you should do is start asking the question, whether it be for yourself, for your colleagues, or family members. And what you should do is be able to, again, go to the places where actually there are good resources. So here is one. The actual wellness program here through the Bar Association would be a place where you could actually go and seek help. They have good referrals and good information where to get help. You can simply get here, and we know it's anonymous. There's actually good resources that are available in our state from the Washington Council on Problem Gambling, which has a website, a phone number, and runs a hotline where you can use call, text, or chat, as well as the National Bar Association's wellness program. Those are the resources that are available in your state. There's actually good reading. So there's actually Michael J. Burke, who is a former lawyer, who actually has a really nice story about his own life as a lawyer who lost his law practice because of his problem gambling. It's a great read. It's very short. It's easy to access. And again, there are also other resources that are available for both financial issues and, again, to learn more about therapeutic justice. I want to thank everyone today for your time and listening to me about this particular issue. Thank you. Do we have time for questions or no?
Take like one or two. We'll take a couple.
Okay.
We got to go quick though. So can you please say more about gambling in adolescence? Our 14-year-old has developed a strong interest in Pokemon, the card game. He's attending his first in-person game soon. Is this a problem? I mean, could that lead to...
There are lots of questions that parents are asking about the current way in which social media and social marketing games are being played. There are very similarities between that and gambling. The industry itself has actually argued they're not gambling because people don't put their own money towards it. Others have argued it is gambling because in order to move up levels in the game, you actually do have to buy things. And so there's a debate in the industry. When you're looking for help, I would say in our own area, there actually is an online, or there is a center here in Washington State. I'm blanking on their name, but I will try to find it and make that available. There actually is areas that are looking specifically on addictions to gaming, and that is a real issue. It's not in the DSM, but there are treatment providers who will definitely look at that. And if you call the Evergreen Council on Problem Gambling, they can give you the referral of that exact place of where to get for adolescents who are having problems related to their gambling. Thank you. We're done?
I think that's it.
Okay. Thank you all again. I really appreciate it. Thank you.